The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
Tonight we have a very special guest. Nancy Gentile spent 39 years as a research librarian in various capacities in private and public libraries. After stints at the Newton Public Library and the Millipore Corporation, her longest tenure was at the Robbins Library in Arlington, Massachusetts, where she was the head of adult services. Nancy has been a docent at the Bedford Whaling Museum since 2017. She developed Women at Sea, True Tales of Whaling Wives during the last several years, and developed more stories to tell during the summer of 2024. Nancy.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So someone once asked me, well, why were you so interested in whaling history? And I said, because what they did goes beyond anybody's imagination, really. But then when I started discovering whaling wives who went with their husbands on these voyages, sometimes of 3 or 4 years, it was really beyond anybody's imagination. These women were mostly all trailblazers. So tonight I'm going to talk about 6 or 7 women who went. There were something like 443 wives who traveled with their husbands during whaling voyages. It started in about 1819. That was when the first documented lady went. And it went till about 1925, when the last few ladies went with their husbands. I'm going to talk about the really early ladies, and then in the middle, in the 1830s and 40s, sort of the middle period. And then the bulk of women went after 1850. I think they probably supposed that if all of these earlier women could do it, so could they, you know. But it's something like 1 in 5 of all voyages, there was a whaling wife on board ship. So we have knowledge of about 77 women who actually either wrote letters or, published their journals or had family members publish their journals after the fact. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about them, but what I want to do first is tell you all about Joan Druett. So this is a lady from New Zealand. She's probably one of the first, if not the first woman to do an exhaustive amount of research on whaling wives. She and her husband were on a trip to Rarotonga, and it's a small island. Has anyone been there? I certainly have not. But you could ride around the island on a bike. It takes a couple of hours. There's a volcano in the middle. And they'd been there more than once, and they're traveling around, the perimeter of the island. And in the distance, they see this gentleman who's digging, purposefully digging. And they're pretty curious, and they want to take a break. And they find this broken down tree. It's still throwing some shade. And so they get under the tree, and her husband walks up to this guy and asks him, what's he doing? What's he digging? So he said that he had an ancestor who was coming to him in a dream and told him to go over to this particular area on Rarotonga and start digging because there was a leftover grave there. It was under the ground. And in Rarotonga, as in many places, especially in the US, cemeteries are very important, and people would go to Rarotonga cemeteries and dress them up, place flowers. It was like heaven on earth and so forth. So he was really surprised that there would be this underground grave that nobody knew anything about. Just very briefly for a moment about Joan Druett. She was so fascinated by what I'm about to tell you that she came to the US and she spent some time in Providence, on Long Island and Sag Harbor, and one other, Cold Spring Harbor as well as New Bedford and Nantucket and so forth. And she did as much research as she could for a couple of years on whaling wives. And if you want to read something really wonderful, it's her Petticoat Whalers book. You can see it over here on the right. She tells you a little bit about each woman. Lots of photographs, really fascinating. She did a really hefty amount of research. She came here on a Fulbright scholarship. She's an historian herself, and she also writes novels. You may have seen her things in the library. She's a lovely lady. She's still alive. So as she's hanging out and her husband's walking around looking at this grave site, she comes across this gravestone on the right. And I'm going to read it for you. It's very difficult to read. It says, "To the memory of Mary Ann, the beloved wife of Captain A.D. Sherman of the American whale ship Harrison, who departed this life January 5th, 1850, aged 24 years." So she's really surprised at this. I have a quote here. She said, "She knew that whale ships were around. They were small, dirty tubs, overfilled with rough men. She had no idea that women were in them." This is the early 80s now, 1980s. So that's when she decides to do her research. The interesting thing about this stone is that in Padenarum Cemetery, which is in South Dartmouth, there's a stone for Mary Ann Sherman. And this is really interesting. She was sort of buried twice because a lot of Quaker parents, and not even of the Quaker persuasion, but a lot of early settlers, when these wives took off with their husbands, some were supportive, but most were not. Most parents were not. So what they did with Mary Ann, she's born in 1825, and if you look at the stone, this is in the Padenarum Cemetery in South Dartmouth, it says that she died in 1845. Well, that's the year she left with her husband. So they just considered her dead when she took off, and that she wasn't coming back. In this particular case, she did not come back. This is a very interesting story. But in any case, she was probably a servant in the Sherman household, and she got together with one of the young men and married him in the household. So why did these women go? This is a very early photograph, a daguerreotype very likely, or maybe an ambrotype, of what we think are women whose wives went to sea. The two ladies on the right are wives of agents. Just very briefly, the whaling hierarchy goes this way. You've got the whale ship owners up here. Typically, there are about 10 or 12 of them that invest heavily. In those days, 1850, 1840s, it cost $30,000 to $40,000 to launch a whale ship. During those days, you know, if you had a farm, it might cost you $2,500, $3,000 a year. So this was more like, a huge project, the kind of project that only wealthy people could invest in. Later on, you see that some people invested, a 16th, a 32nd of a share, etc. But most of these Quaker guys just got together, very sober businessmen, and trusted one another. So you had just 10 or 12 people investing about $3,000 each. And that's, in today's money, that's about $100,000 a piece. All you have to do is multiply it by 30 for the most part to get the right figures. A lot of the time, whale ships, it was just made more sense to outfit an old merchant ship because of the expense, and that's what they often did. Has anyone been to the Whaling Museum and gotten on the Lagoda half-scale model? So the Lagoda was a converted merchant ship. It was built in Duxbury in 1826, and eventually it was converted and purchased by Jonathan Bourne, made a lot of money for him. And they would change some of the rigging, so it was a little bit easier to sail. Because most of the guys that got on these ships by 1850 didn't know how to whale or sail. They were going to be trained and so forth when they got on there. But in any case, the agent is the next guy down on the totem pole. And the agent is, if you've built a building in your town and you had to hire a clerk of the works, who was a go-between between the town and the construction people, that's what an agent was. The agent more or less hired folks, but he outfitted the ship. And he was usually invested. Quakers knew what they were doing. They figured if this guy invested, he was going to do a good job, make sure everything went well. So he got all of the foodstuffs, all of the tools, the water, wood for burning, and so forth on the ship. If you look at that second page on your handout, that's a guy named Elmo Homan, who wrote probably one of the best histories of whaling there is. I think it was written in the 20s. I apologize if the second page is not on your sheet, but you can look Mr. Homan up. It's Hohman. He was a great writer. And he has a load of appendices on the back of the book, and that's one of them. You can see the kinds of things they had to put on these ships. So the agents were heavily invested, and then the agents hired outfitters. And the outfitters got some money, and they went around to villages and as far away as the Middle Atlantic looking for young guys to get on these ships. And they'd supply them with a $75 outfit, which would be their oil skins and what they were going to eat with, and before 1830, maybe some rum and so forth. They would entice them to get on the ship. You know, talk about the wonders of the Pacific, and all you had to do was knock on the captain's cabin door and you'd get a meat pie whenever you wanted one, and so forth. And they were just luring these guys into town, get them into a boarding house, and hope that they stayed there, tried to make certain that they stayed there overnight, and then get them onto the ship the next day. This is not the case in early Nantucket whaling and so forth, when you had families and neighbors going out on a whale ship together. This is a different operation. This is a commercial operation. And they were looking for anybody that would get on these ships. And most guys didn't last more than about a year because it was just so difficult. So after the outfitters, when you got back in, there were the infitters, pretty much land sharks. And so they'd be ready, sometimes they'd come right on board ship to give you what you needed to get back on land. A suit of clothing, maybe some money to get the haircut, maybe an overnight stay in a boarding house and so forth. But they were paying through the nose, the young guys, for all of this. Everything was marked up. A lot of the profits were made on the backs of crew members. So in any case, we know that these two ladies were agents' wives. We think these ladies were captains' wives, but we don't know who they are. We don't have their names or anything like that. Small quarters on these ships, very small. They weren't much bigger than a scalloper that you see in New Bedford Harbor. 100, 110 feet long. Lots of insects and rodents, dampness, bad weather, illness. Unlike British whale ships, the American whale ship captain was the surgeon. They didn't have surgeons on board American whale ships. It was the captain who carried a little, chest of interesting looking chemicals, and I'll talk about that as we get along. There was pregnancy on board, and the captain would have to act as a midwife very often, unless they dropped their wives off, which they often did on places like St. Helena's Island in the South Atlantic, or the Bay of Islands. Let me go over to a map and show you what a typical route is. A couple of different routes were usually taken. In the really early days, they were going after these guys, which were baleen whales. Baleen whales swim on the surface of the ocean. They were really close to the coast, like cod was, so they didn't have to go out far to find these whales. They're all around the world, actually. But when they started going further and further, it was because they discovered sperm whales. And sperm whales are pelagic whales, meaning they dive deep. They're way out in the ocean, usually at least 500 miles off the coast. In any case, so New Bedford's up here, right at the butt of the blue arrow there, and they would travel over to the Azores in this configuration of the green line. And they would usually get new crew members there. Some of these guys didn't even last that long. They'd head back to New Bedford, and they'd be looking for new crew members, water, fruit, etc. The Azores is a pretty deep ocean around it, so a lot of them went whaling for sperms right in the Azores area. Then they'd head down to Cabo Verde, right here off the coast of Africa, and do the same thing. And then they'd head pretty much south along the St. Helena's is right in here, and go around Cape of Good Hope and up into the Indian Ocean and come around to the Bay of Islands here near Australia. That was a big pit stop in the early 1830s and 40s. Eventually that moved up to the Sandwich Islands. The men were causing such lunacy there with the Maori women and so forth, and the mission people, the missionaries were getting very upset over it. And eventually the British came in and started charging the whale ships lots of tariffs. And so they moved. In any case, this red line is mostly where lots of whalemen went. They would take the same route, go over to the Azores and down to Cape Verde, and then around the coast of South America, and then up into the Pacific. And you'll hear, if you read stories about whaling, they were whaling along the line, up and down the line. Does anybody know what the line is? It's the equator. And there's just there would be a lot of fish swimming around in there because of the currents. You know, you had the southern equatorial current and the northern one, and just a lot of turbulence there. So there'd be a lot of whales feeding along there, so they thought. And so that's what they would do. And then they would head up into the Aleutian Islands area and north of there by the middle of 1857 or so, I think, and up into the Bering Strait and beyond into the Arctic to look for bowhead whales. Bowhead whales had baleen, same type of whale, about 10 feet long. And their blubber was about twice as thick as regular blubber. So it was really a lucrative thing to go after bowheads, but very dangerous. Lots of, lots of ice and fog and wind up there. I'm going to tell a story at the end that will probably raise the hairs on your head. But in any case, that's the typical route, and a captain would get instructions. They would take notes down about where the best places were to go to find whales. It didn't always happen. A lot of these whale ships didn't come back full because of the frustration of not being able to find whales. In any case, let's just move along and start talking about our ladies. This is a picture of the Bay of Islands off New Zealand, very pretty. I've read stories of women who meet the international consuls on these islands, and they go horseback riding and all kinds of nice things. But if we needed to explain why a woman would go, the story of Eliza Williams really serves pretty well. So Eliza and Captain Tom Williams, they're both young and married. They're from Wethersfield, Connecticut. He's been a captain for a few years. He's been on a couple of voyages. He really likes what he's doing. You can see this book here, One Whaling Family by Harold Williams. I think that was the grandson. He was also a whaler. That's well worth reading. Very interesting journal that she wrote. So he goes off whaling. He comes back. He's home for about 6 or 8 months. That was a typical time they'd be home. She gets pregnant first time. He goes off for a couple of years, comes back and meets his first son, Stancil. He's home for another 6 or 8 months. She gets pregnant again. He goes off for another 3 years. It's a long time to be gone. He comes back and meets his second son, Henry. So whatever passed for a watch in those days, I can imagine Eliza looking at the clock and thinking, oh my God, it's been 5 years. I've seen my husband, probably for about 18 months total, and he barely knows his children. So 5 months pregnant, she boards the next ship. She leaves her kids home. Not all women did this. They might have been close to school age by that time. Quite often women would leave especially their sons home if they were school age. She left them with relatives, which would have been very difficult for her to do. And she sailed with her husband a bunch of years. This is kind of an interesting story because you read a lot that captains, all they wanted to do was make a lot of money, as much as they could, and then buy a nice farm and settle down someplace. He bought this beautiful farm in Connecticut, and 2 years later he sold it, and he went whaling again. And he and his wife ended up moving to San Francisco, which was itself quite a large whaling station, late 19th century. So she survived a couple of shipwrecks and had a couple more children on board ship. And essentially what these women do, and she did a lot of this, was to nurse men on board ship. There was some sort of a fracas on board, and she saw it happen, and of course they had to hold this guy down that got hurt. He had needed stitches in his abdomen, and so there was a young guy that couldn't handle it that was supposed to hold him down, and his wife, who stood in the crook of his shoulder, I've got a few other pictures, very short, tiny lady, she held him down, and she did most of the nursing on board that ship. Really interesting family. So I thought I'd put a picture in of what a whale ship typically looks like. This is the Charles W. Morgan, the last living whale ship in existence. It's down in Mystic, and you can board it if you want. It's a lot of fun. But you can see it's not very large. And, you know, if a wife was lucky enough, her husband would build a deck house right in front of the rear mast, the mizzen mast, for her. It would be about 6 by 6 feet, look something like this, and they could stay in there and have tea and pretty much be isolated from the men. They would usually sew there. You know, there's no clothing off the rack in those days, and even if they were lousy sewers, they ended up making shirts and stuff like that for men on board ship. They would knit in there, sew, read, have their children in there. A lot of women, if they were doing serious nursing, would put the men in one of these because the air up on the deck was so much better than in the forecastle, which is where the men slept. There'd be 25 or 30, well, half of them would be on board working and half of them would be down there sleeping, but they ate down there and slept down there. It was pretty rank down there, and the air was much better. But you can see, this is a contemporary picture from someone's thesis, but you can see that it wasn't really tied down. So if there was a bad storm, the thing could blow off deck, and so the captain would ask his wife to please stay below in the staterooms and so forth if there was bad weather. Unlike what you might read or hear about, women did cook on board these ships because they couldn't tolerate some of the stewards' meals. And there was like a little pantry down in the basement of the ship, and you'll see it in the Charles W. Morgan if you go. And it's kind of neat. I mean, they would prepare meat pies and just send them up to the galley. The most important thing these women did was they wrote journals. And it was really an interesting perspective to hear from a woman. Logbooks are pretty boring. I mean, it's just the weather, whether they caught whales, who died, and so forth. Very cryptic, and they needed to be. I mean, you'll read a lot of interesting men's memoirs of being on board ship, and I've put a couple on your list. Probably one of the best ones I've ever read is Nelson Cole Haley's book, Being on the Charles W. Morgan. He had a wonderful memory. But we probably wouldn't have quite the perspective of what went on board, what happened, unless we had these women's journals. Because, you know, they were watching what was going on from 6 in the morning till 12 at night very often. This is just a quick diagram. This is the bow of the ship. It's where the barrels would be, casks. This is the stateroom on the starboard side of the ship, always on the starboard side, and still are, I think, in most ships on the starboard side. And then that little red circle there is where the women's deck house would be. Just a quick set of pictures on what it looks like down below typically. This is a sort of a parlor navigation room. The captain would be, you know, plotting his spots out on that desk to the left. There's a door here with a head, so that would very likely be the bathroom for the wife. I've read stories where mothers might put their little tiny kids in these cubbies up here to take naps and so forth. So it's pretty tight. This is a 3/4 bed, and if you look carefully at it, you'll see there's this white wooden post with a longitudinal box underneath. So that is a bed that's gimbaled, right? So it's up above the floor, and when the ship rolls, it's designed to roll with the ship. So theoretically, you always stay level when you're sleeping. Based on some of these women's stories, it did not help seasickness at all. but that's how it's made. And there's one on the Charles W. Morgan, I think, that looks just like that. But our first documented lady is Mary Hayden Russell. So we don't have a picture of her, unfortunately. I looked and looked and looked. But this is an autograph of her daughter, Mary Ann Jewett, who lived in Rye, New York. And this is Captain Laban Russell over there on the right. She's the earliest documented wife to travel with her husband. She went in 1817 from Milford Haven, Wales. You might ask, well, why was she leaving from Wales? She's a good Nantucket Quaker wife. So during 1775 and 1812, everything was shut down in New Bedford and Nantucket. And the Nantucketers were really frustrated by that, during the wars, because their only livelihood mostly was whaling. They wanted to be neutral. They didn't even want to hook up with the Massachusetts legislature, but they were not going to allow the Nantucketers not to be part of Massachusetts. So if a whaler was out during the time of the war, they would hide somewhere down south or whatever. Some of them came back and were impressed into the British Navy. Lots of problems. And so there was a family on Nantucket up till about 1760 called the Roach family, R-O-T-C-H. And they just started looking for other whaling stations to create them. So they went to Great Britain, they went to France. They ended up in Nova Scotia and in Wales. That's where they had the most success. But you'll read about a lot of British sailors who went to England to sail, especially the Nantucket captains, because they needed work during the war and so forth. They tried to do it in France, but that was just before their revolution, so they got out of there. So that's why she was leaving from Wales. And she must have liked it because she sailed again in 1824 with her son, who had become a boat steerer. I'll read you a quick quote from her. She's writing to her daughter, Mary Ann, and she saw her husband's boat disappear in a thunderstorm. They didn't fish off the side of a ship. They were going in these 30-foot long whale boats looking for whales. And so she sees her husband's boat disappear in a thunderstorm and out of sight for a few hours. And she's watching from the deck, and then she sees her son's boat dragged off by a whale. She says, quote, "Think how anxious I must have been and how happy I was to see your father. He had not a dry thread in his clothes. I thought, this is the way these sons of the ocean earn their money that is so thoughtlessly spent at home." And that's her original letter there. I believe that's at the Whaling Museum in Nantucket. But you can get this right online. Actually, that's where I got it. She also was a very good nurse on board ship. This couple are really interesting, Captain Benjamin Morrell and Abby Jane Morrell. So Captain Morrell was kind of an opportunist, He went looking for good whaling grounds, but he would go sealing or walrusing and so forth, whatever made sense to him. And the story goes that he gets back to Salem in the early 1800s, and he's got this funny feeling of foreboding, like there's going to be some calamity that he has to deal with. It just didn't feel right. And a couple of days later in Salem, he gets a letter saying that his wife and 2 children had died of smallpox. And so he's devastated. He comes back down to Connecticut, where he's from. He's from Stonington, Connecticut. And he meets up with some family at some point, and he has this young cousin, Abby, who's about 15 years old. She was born and brought up in New York City, and she's moved to Connecticut, and he wants to marry her. But she's only 15, and this wouldn't be proper. So he decides, well, if I leave, she might get taken. So I'm going to talk to her parents, and they make this arrangement. He said, well, I'll go off, I'll marry her, and we'll be married, and she'll go off, and I will go off on a voyage, and by the time I get back, she'll be a lovely, young, mature lady. She was 15 at the time, maybe at 18 or 19. And that's what they did. And he comes home after a few years, takes a couple of voyages, and she begs him that she really wants to go with him. This is really interesting. She wrote her own book on this called Captain's Wife. It's all about what happens when she goes on a voyage with him. She's also another very early voyager. They sailed in 1829. So they're off in the Cook Islands and various other islands in the Pacific. And he leaves her behind and he goes hunting around. And he and his men land on an island in the north of New Guinea called Bismarck. And they decide that, well, they're not finding whales. They go after these bêche de mer, or sea cucumbers. They're these little guys on the bottom here. They're usually found on the bottom of the ocean. And they were considered an Asian delicacy. They were harvested, from the ocean floor, and they were dried. You just hang them up on clotheslines and dry them. And you'd sell them. And they're still a delicacy. You can see a contemporary bottle of them right here on the left. They're really kind of small, and an Asian market. So they stop off at this island, not bothering to check with the indigenous people there to see if they're going to have any trouble. And it turns out that the natives were not happy with them, and they started warring with them and killing a lot of them. And so they staggered back to their ship, and they're determined to get revenge. They go back and they pick up this lovely lady and take her back on the ship, and she witnesses the whole thing. They go back and they take guns and cannons and mow the natives down. And so you can see why there was some bad feeling among South Pacific Islanders about whalers, because they could be very disruptive. He's also written a book, but in the writing world, people claim that her rendition of what happened is more truthful than his. So this is Caroline Mayhew. She was from Martha's Vineyard. A lot of Mayhews on the vineyard. And the story goes, the original founder was Thomas Mayhew from Watertown, Mass., and he went down to the vineyard and started his life there. And Caroline was a descendant. Her dad was a physician. She knew her way around a medicine chest. And she sailed with her husband in the 1830s and 1840s. They spent a lot of time on the Bay of Islands. She was able to nurse some men back to life. They had 8 or 9 of them had gotten smallpox. And then her husband got smallpox, and she was helping the helmsman to navigate the ship as well as nurse these guys. So she really knew what she was doing. There are something like 25 to 35 wives from the vineyard who sailed out of New Bedford with their captain husbands. We don't know if it's because it's so isolated, it was an island, and or whatever, but quite a few women sailed from the islands. They probably had been around the world first before they ever headed to downtown Boston, If you were going to read anybody's journal and you had a lot of time on your hands, I would read Mary Brewster's. It's been annotated by Joan Drouet, the lady I talked about at the beginning. It's very thick. She annotates quite a bit of it. She's very determined. You can see she's very lovely. She's got this beautiful silk dress on and a lovely shawl. Very determined woman. She married Captain William Brewster. She was adopted. She knew some of her siblings, but her parents died when she was about 5 years old. And the name of her journal is She Was a Sister Sailor, Mary Brewster's Whaling Journals, 1845, again early, to 1851. She went on 2 voyages with her husband. But her parents didn't want her to go. No self-respecting young woman was going to get on a whale ship. And she was determined to go. And then finally her mother said she wouldn't be welcome back in the house if she went. She was getting all kinds of advice from people. She was from Connecticut as well, Stonington, Connecticut. I just want to read you this quote. She ruminates a lot in her journal, and she says, "With this determination I came, blow high or low, I would try and make the best of everything, which determination I trust will be kept. I often find myself thinking of home and kind friends and acquaintances, but have no wish to be with them at present. I have chosen my own place of residence not from the impulse of the moment, but after much calm and sober thought. In coming, my own conscience tells me I was doing right, and what do I care for the opinion of the world or what some who have professed much friendship for me will say. So she does quite a bit of thinking in this journal. It's amazing. She was very determined, and she was very happy she went with her husband. Has anyone been on Maui, taken the road to Hana?
Yeah, I've been to Maui.
What's it like?
Beautiful. It's harsh.
It's steep, right?
Very harsh, yeah.
So what happens is a lot of whale ship captains would leave, their wives in the Sandwich Islands in Hawaii. Sometimes whale ship owners would let them go up to the Arctic, and sometimes they wouldn't. Mary Brewster's been up into the Arctic, probably one of the first, if not the first woman to do that. But in this particular year, her husband dropped her off. And she was in Maui, and she was bored, and she was friendly with some missionaries, and they said, come on with us, we're going to go to Hana to drop off some supplies. So of course they take horses, and they go with some people whose mobility isn't great. And you can see this picture on the right, it's pretty dangerous. And she talks a lot about how the horses were terrified and they get down on their knees, drop people off the side of the horse, and they had some pretty close calls. But they end up, managing to get to Hana. They camp along the way. It's amazing to me. I'd be hiding somewhere far, very far away from all this. And so they end up in what is now the Haleakala National Park, and they get to view the volcanoes and so forth. They have a wonderful time. So she was really intrepid lady. And I'm really glad she went with her husband, because she died younger than him. She didn't live a whole lot longer once she got back to Connecticut. Just going to read you a quote from Martha Brewer Brown, Captain Edwin Brown. You can see that young picture of her, and then her as an older lady. She says, quote, there are some men here who do not want to work, and I'm lazy as any. It's been 3 weeks since I've washed, but today have plenty of soft rain, and I have reveled.
3 weeks.
She sailed with her husband from 1848 to 1851, so there aren't any men who are lazy on these ships. What she's talking about, very likely, is the South Pacific. It's hot. They haven't found any whales. They're in the doldrums. The heat is unrelenting, and there's no breeze. And you ladies talk about getting up on the deck and walking around the deck and then going back down to the stateroom, going back up again, and their children doing crazy things like throwing their cats off the side of the ship, and the captain's having to go and retrieve them, and just, all sorts of hellacious stuff going on. But they're hot, and you couldn't really wash with the drinking water on board a ship. They had these great big casks that they would put the water in, and they had to wait to wash up, And so usually what I think they would do, my friend Captain Mike Taylor tells me, they probably would let the decks flood during a rainstorm and then pump the water into casks for people to wash with. So it could be really taxing. Okay, medicine, pretty primitive at this time. So as I mentioned before, whaling captains in the United States did not have surgeons on board ship. They were the surgeons. But these rules are meant to be broken, and so here we have the contents of Dr. John King's chest aboard the Aurora, 1819 Nantucket whaler. So he was a surgeon, and he was on board this Nantucket ship. And this is a picture of his medicine chest. You can find this online. He wrote a journal, which is also online. He lists on each page how he used every one of these chemicals. So in the 1850s, medicine was very primitive. They still used very old theories that there were 4 humors: red bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm. And if those were not kept in balance, then disease happened. And the only way you could get rid of it was to purge it. So they wanted you either to vomit, to defecate, to sweat it out. They did bloodletting, which we probably all know about, or blistering, where they would put a plaster with some of the stuff on the left here, all concocted together, and hope that the poison would leave your system that way. So mercury was heavily used. They knew mercury was bad stuff, but it was kind of like chemotherapy. I mean, it was all that they had, and so they used it a lot for venereal disease, especially. Laudanum, of course, would put you to sleep. Quinine, they had discovered, would treat malaria. So they had quinine. Dover's powder. Does anyone remember Ipecac? Yeah, so that would be something that would make you vomit. Opium, copper sulfate, zinc sulfate, Epsom salts. Something called calomel, which had mercury in it, antimony, which was a metal, guaiacum, resin, oil, alcohol, herbs and roots. Herbs and roots were big. Botany was a big thing in those days. They had just discovered it. Rosemary, mint, thistle, horseradish, clover, sage balm, thyme, absinthe, which was, I think it was 90 proof. Absinthe was very, very strong, had a lot of alcohol in it. Comfrey. You can see here at the bottom this little yellow circle, and there's a handle and a hook at the end. Does anybody want to guess what that was?
It says keep it full of teeth.
That's right. When we show this to the kids and we give them tours, they freak out. It's like, oh my God, I never want to get on a whale ship. But that's what they would. And having diseased teeth was a real issue on board ship. And also cuts in the hands and feet from being exposed to so much salt water. That was huge, among many other things. It's really kind of interesting. I was looking up some of these medicines before, and I just want to read, like syrup of squills was made from a sea onion. Quinine was from the Peruvian bark cinchona tree. Paregoric, of course, was opium. And then smelling salts were made, at least for a portion of time, from the heated horns of oxen and deer. Amazing. Yikes. So yeah, pretty serious stuff. They knew about lemons and limes being good for scurvy. They were just beginning to learn about that. But if you were a whaling ship and you were out in the ocean and this was a big business, you didn't stop a lot. You stopped at certain points along the way. Why do you think they didn't do a lot of stopping? Why would you think that they would?
They might run for it.
That's right.
They might run for it.
Most of these guys would jump ship. They'd park the ship about a half a mile away from port, and these guys still jumped ship because they were so disgusted with the conditions on board ship. It's really interesting to read about some of the consuls in the islands around the world. The consul's job was to negotiate, and take care of a sick crew member who would be discharged. But sometimes the guys just got really tired of whaling, and they would concoct all sorts of stories about how they weren't being fed properly, the ship was falling apart, they were being abused, so forth. Many times this was true. There's some crazy captains out there, and they just felt like they had control, which they did once they got out there. And so the consuls had a very difficult time. How are we doing for time here? Okay. Let me tell you about Captain Whiteside. So most of these stories are very positive. They're really interesting. But this story is a good example of what can go horribly wrong on a whaling voyage. Captain Joseph Whiteside is up in the Arctic with his wife, Flora Clow, who is a New Bedford shop girl. This is called the disaster of 1897. It was big in New Bedford because in 1997, the New Bedford Standard Times did a whole article on it. So it was really a huge story at the time. So there are about 19 ships that were cruising through the Bering Strait, and they were going to be docking. Let me show you where this is so you can get an idea. They were going to be docking in Icy Cape. A lot of whales, they were traveling in, they were traveling at the end of July, and that's the beginning of the fall up in the Arctic. And a lot of whales will travel way up beyond the Bering Strait into this area up here, and they were going to be wintering over very likely and looking for whales up there. So there were 19 whale ships. They were all docking at Icy Cape, and they were docking on ice floes, which are these great big pieces of ice. You can't skate on them. You know, they're all jagged and so forth. And the story goes, and we're not certain that this is exactly true, but the story goes that Flora Clow could not stand the wife next to her on another ship. Their ship was called the Navarre. Captain Joseph Whiteside and his wife's ship was called the Navarre. The ship beside them was the Carluke. Haven't been able to get the wife's name there, but she disliked her intensely, so he decides to move the ship. And he begins to head further north and east. And suddenly his ship is being taken up by the wind. So whalers would only sail along what they called leads, which were just open areas of ocean. And it was usually along the shore. But there were some westerly winds that were pushing down on the shore like this. And so what were they doing? They were pushing the ice floes down onto the shore. So his ship gets caught in these ice floes, and it just begins heading out to sea and getting slightly crushed. And there's an enormous pounds of pressure that can destroy a ship in no time at all. And so he's heading further and further north, drifting. And there's this guy named Charlie Brower. He's a guy that's been up there for a bunch of years. He heads a whaling station up there. He's married an Inupiat lady. And he goes to meet these ships, and he boards the Navarre. And he says to Captain Whiteside, we're going to have to do something here. We're going to have to more or less leave the ship. There are about 40 guys on this particular ship. Maybe 10 or so stayed on the ship, and 30 left. They started walking towards shore, and they were drifting as they were walking. And so Brower says to them, you have to make certain that you take your whale boats and put a false keel on them of 5 or 6 or 7 inches to protect it. Because when you drag these things, even if you drag fiberglass along ice, it's going to break up. And after a few miles, they ran into lots of bad weather, water flowing up onto the ice floes. Mrs. Whiteside is getting frail. Everybody's freaking out. And so they decide they're going to have to walk back to the ship. This is 10 miles away now. They walk 10 miles back to the ship. Charlie Brower makes a canvas whale boat that's much more, sort of light-weighted. And they put all these supplies on. They realize they're going to be out there for a while, guns, food, and so forth. And they start walking forward. They put Mr. and Mrs. Whiteside in this canvas boat. So as they're walking along, Charlie Brower is trailblazing. And he sends some men back to Mr. and Mrs. Whiteside and says, we need some supplies and so forth. Well, Mr. Whiteside has decided he's drinking, and he's decided every man for himself. And in fact, the quote says, every woman for herself, which makes no sense to me. So they take that boat and they take off looking for help. And they leave these 30 men out on the ice floes to try and get back to shore. Really bad weather. They had a couple of guns. They end up eating the leather on their boots because all they had was some hardtack, just a few ounces of hardtack. And so the real, hero here is not Whiteside, it's Charlie Brower. What ends up happening, let me go back to that diagram real quickly. What ends up happening is that the ship is out at the tip somewhere beyond Point Barrow, and Brower and his men are drifting on these ice floes. And eventually Brower says to his men, if we get on a smaller ice floe, maybe it'll just flow faster to the shore. And the guys are terrified, but they end up doing that, and they get rescued right here. And so they've been drifting for days. 15 men were killed or committed suicide, and 15 survived. And there was one Portuguese man who survived who was still crying, a couple of years later, describing how horrendous this episode was. But there's a ship, a revenue cutter, that sees them. They think they're walrus. And this Inupiat on board ship says, no, these are people. And so they go and grab them, and they survive. And it turns out that Mr. and Mrs. Whiteside end up on a little island out there, and they get rescued as well. So Mrs. Whiteside really needed to stay home that day. This is a picture of them here after the rescue. And these are some of the men who were survivors.
So the guys that were on the ice, they died, reading their roots?
15 of them died.
Oh, so some were rescued.
Some were rescued.
It's September, they're gonna wait till next August before the ice breaks up. It's September, they passed it.
That's right. They were in, well, and they,
They're into winter.
Yes.
At Point Barrow. There's like about 2 weeks in August where the ice will break up.
yes,
Any gasoline tankers can come in. And
yes,
it.
that's right.
So
They,
there's
by this
stuff where they
time,
missed.
this is 1897, by this time they have revenues coming in, taking supplies to them. It's much easier to whale in one sense. They winter over, is basically what they do, and then they wait for the ice to break up. And this is Charlie Brower over here on the right. And there are some people who have come into the museum. It's such an interesting place. Last name, they're from Alaska, Inupiat people whose last name is Brower. You know, and we think it's got to be the same family, you know. I'll talk very briefly about this lady. You can see by this time, this is around 1913, the hoop skirts are gone, the style has changed, her hair is long and straight. And that's Antonio Corbello and his wife, Maria. He had 2 different mutinies on board ship, and Maria was present for the second mutiny. By this time, a lot of Cape Verdeans and Portuguese have purchased these whale ships because a lot of the original Yankee guys have gotten out of the business and they're investing in other things. And so the story goes that while he was up in the rigging directing a hunt, 3 crew members attacked the cook, the steward, and the helmsman. The steward locked himself in his cabin and the mutineers banged the door with sledgehammers. His wife alerted him and he got wind of what was going on. He rushed down to quell the riot with boots and fists. Troublemakers were clapped into irons and jailed in Barbados. And actually, this is 1919 on their second voyage, and of course, this is the time of the influenza. And after the end of the voyage, he dies of the influenza. So pretty scary stuff there. And that's the end of my story. This is just a brief discussion here of, in the early days, if women were wearing hoop skirts, they would be kind of carried over the side of a ship to visit with another ship, which was called a gam. And that's sort of a hollowed out barrel. This is down to the sea in ships. This is on a film here, you know. But we've got one of these barrels at the Whaling Museum. And that's what they would do. These are bloomers that many women would wear because they could have their skirts up above their knees if they walked onto messy, oily decks. And that is it. That is my story. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions? You must have some questions. It's a complicated business.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So the whales are huge.
Yes.
So when they went whaling, there was their vessel, and then they went off on the little ships, right? The little boats.
The little boats.
But they were so big. How did they cut them off? How did they cut off the whales?
Right. So they would, once they killed the whale, they would put a hole in the tail, and they would travel back to the mother ship. There was a lot of stuff in the boats. You know, they had, it's gone out of my head. You know what I mean, the thing that helps you find your way. Compasses. Thank you. They had compasses, yay. And what they would do with the ship is they would haul it up and make it stationary in a certain way so that it was facing the wind and that the starboard side of the ship was also facing the worst part of the wind. So the ship's going this way, and once they connect the whale, the whole thing won't keel over. I may have said that backwards, but anyway, they would come back to the ship, take maybe half an hour, 3 hours, or 5 hours, 5 miles an hour, very, very slow if it was a large whale. And once they got back to the ship, they would tie it up on one end, and then they would take a couple of lances like this, and they would cut through the blubber on either side of what they called a blanket piece. And they would peel it like an orange, essentially. So 3 or 4 travels around the side of the whale. They took blubber out from other parts of the whale that had valuable oil, especially the sperm whale, the spermaceti in the head, and so forth. A lot of this work was done with blocks and tackle and a winch, or not really a winch, but the other thing that begins with W. It'll come to me. But they would hang a sperm whale's head off the side of the ship if it was too large, and they would work with it that way. Once it was done, Yankee whalers just dropped the bones right into the ocean. And it was very complicated. Sometimes if the weather was bad, they'd have to swim under the whale and undo some of the chains that got balled up while they were twisting it, turning it. And then they would take that blanket piece, which is about 10 feet long, 5 feet wide, and they would cut it into what they called horse pieces, which were about like this. And then they'd cut it into a smaller piece called a Bible leaf. And so they would sort of slice it up. They called it a Bible leaf because it looked like a book. And the skin was attached on the bottom. They just throw it into 2 large try-works that were lit with logs initially. They had like a trough underneath and a couple of guys standing guard to make certain nothing bad happened. And they would basically what they called try out the whale for several days, sometimes shorter, depending on what size whale it was. A lot of the stuff was down below. If the weather was bad enough, they'd do it right on the deck to get the job done. Yeah, and sperm oil with spermaceti was different. It didn't really have to be boiled. All it needed was scalding. And then, of course, they would take these guys, because this was a product. This is baleen. There are toothed whales and baleen whales. And toothed whales are the sperm whale, the porpoise, the dolphin, the killer whale, belugas, the little cute white whales, and the narwhals. That's basically, and then there are some river dolphins and so forth. So they just left from San Francisco, you know. But it stopped then. Norway, Iceland, Japan, Russia's no longer doing it. There's a little island down off the coast, the St. Vincent Island off the coast of the United States that still does a little bit of whaling. But it stopped here officially with the International Whaling Commission. They had, you know, got together in the 1940s and started making rules, but it wasn't until 1974 that they passed the Marine Mammal Protection Act. I can't travel with this stuff unless I have a letter, because it's illegal. I don't own it. We don't own this. It's owned by NOAA.
So how is the whale population doing today, the species?
Right, so there are some whales that have recovered. Bowhead whales have recovered to some extent. Blue whales have recovered. Right whales, especially North Atlantic right whales, are in trouble. There's only, when I got to the museum, there were 450 left. Now there's 350 left, with about 75 females. And they're just getting struck. You know, they're up in the Northeast, and even though they've tried to stay away, ships and so forth, there's a lot of container ships that come in. And they also get caught up in fishing line and pot line and so forth, lobster pots and crab pots and so forth. And it cuts into the skin, and then it's a slow death. So it's a very sad situation. They're trying to come up with different ways using GPS. So you didn't have a rope connected to your buoy any longer. It's down there with a little machine in it, and then you press a button and the lobster pot comes up. They're very expensive, so they're looking for ways to make them less expensive, because the fishermen have to make a living and so forth, so it goes both ways, you know. Yeah. It's a fascinating topic. Yeah. Who knew? When I used to go down into Bedford, I thought it was the mills that ran that place. It wasn't. It was whaling. And then they put all that money in. But the whalers are very opportunistic. They'd go after seals and walruses and all kind of stuff. And they disrupted the livelihoods of a lot of the islanders up there, who their livelihood was walrusing, you know. So there's a lot of nastiness that happened when they were going for walruses. Yeah.
It's interesting the different roles that the women all played on there. So I'm going to take that little info because my husband's grandfather was a sea captain. So it wasn't whaling, but it was a sea captain.
Yeah.
And I just, like in the past week, since his cousin had called me and said, and I go, oh, I'm going to go in Connecticut tomorrow. Okay, or this week I said, I'll come in. And I was like, okay, I gotta dig stuff out for her.
Oh.
And some of it I ran across this thing saying that, you know, he was the sea captain and his wife was the cook. And I'm going, I never knew that. So
Yeah,
I
there were a lot of
had,
merchantmen
like,
who had
you know,
wives.
Get from her brain on that. But I was like,
Yeah.
what else? So now you gave me some insight. What else maybe did she do?
Yes, while she was on board ship.
So if anyone knows, she would know.
They made out a little bit better because the merchant ships were larger and they were just going back and forth in between the same venues, you know, they weren't going around the world. A lot of whaler men were exchanging information with the federal government. There was this guy named Captain Mowry who was a naval commander from the South in the 19th century, and he collected a lot of the logbooks of whalemen because they were charting uncharted seas. You know, they were going where no one else had gone before, and learning how to traverse, you know, the coral and the bad ports and so forth, you know. Yeah, really, really interesting, really adventuresome, you know. Yes?
A superstition about, like, they assume it's bad luck to have a woman on board.
Yes.
Like the 1700s? Or?
That's a British thing. And there are men who just wouldn't go out if their wives were found near the ship or whatever. But that didn't exist here. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. And I'm not sure what period of time that was. Yeah. Yep, didn't happen here, not in America. Any other questions? Okay, let me pick 3 lucky names here. Ken Percy. Yay! It's good forever.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Debbie Oates. Ah, very nice. There you go.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. There's lots of new exhibits there. You'll really enjoy it, I think, if you go. Joanna O'Reilly. Okay. Very good. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.